Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, I'll describe the steps that I recommend for building a pilot plan. If you're going to be piloting your improvements, then I consider the pilot plan to be absolutely essential piece of ensuring that your pilot is successful. Now, as I mentioned in the prior lesson on describing the pilot process, these steps that I'm reviewing about the pilot are virtually the same steps that you can follow when you're ready to implement the final improvements. So I strongly recommend that you view the other lesson about the pilot process before viewing this lesson. But for now, let's dive into defining what is a pilot plan.
Well, it's important to note at this point that, as we had in the previous lesson, the pilot plan is something that is very similar to the implementation plan. So whether you're using the implementation plan or pilot plan, we'll say that even though we're talking about the pilot plan within this lesson, we'll say that it's synonymous with the process and steps you would follow for also building an implementation plan. It's merely that the pilot plan is something that's built ahead of time before you do a full implementation, so that's why we're taking that perspective here. But again, if you've already gone through a pilot, you're ready for implementation, then these process steps will be identical to how you'd want to build the implementation plan. So what is a pilot plan? Well, it's a prioritized list of actions that comprise all the improvements that need to be piloted. So for each of those actions in the pilot plan, the responsible owner and due date for those actions are going to be identified. And the pilot plan also will include a method for how you're going to manage all the actions by tracking each person's progress in executing those actions. So let's say we know what we want to pilot. Do we really need to have a pilot plan? Isn't that something that's just going to slow us down? Well, many people will begin a pilot without actually building a pilot plan. But I would say, well, you might want to consider that old adage that he who fails to plan, plans to fail. Well, in the same way, we need to consider the risk or rewards versus the cost of actually building a pilot plan. So if we were to weigh those out, we might say there's a cost of a 2-hour team meeting, the investment that you'd have to spend in building such a pilot plan like that. It's about 2 hours maybe with your team. But on the other side, there's a risk that you might miss some critical action, or a risk of missing some critical metric that you would need to measure, or the risk of some miscommunication within your team, or the risk of maybe some delays in some critical actions, or you might miss out on the reward of building team confidence. Well, to me, when just evaluating those kinds of things, 2 hours with your team and building a pilot plan is far worth the risks and rewards that you'd gain from having invested that time in building a pilot plan.
Now let's review the 5 steps I recommend for building a pilot plan with your team.
So what is the process for building the pilot plan? Well, it's something, again, that could be built in just about 2 hours with your team, and you could follow these kinds of steps where, as we've shown before, you'd have some sort of input into your team meeting, and then you have some sort of process you follow with your team in order to create some output from the meeting. So first, it starts as an input. You identify all the improvements that you're going to be focusing on. And then for the meeting itself, you'd want to begin with prioritizing all those improvements, breaking down the improvements into actions, and then identifying any prerequisite or sub-actions based off of those. And then finally, for your output from the meeting, you want to assign action owners and due dates so you have that full plan. So here's an example of what the pilot plan would look like with the type of process steps that you might identify. So as an overview, before we get into the explanation of the actual steps that you might follow that we listed up here, this is what the overall output will look like. So we start off with the number 1, number 3, that is the identifying the improvements and breaking them into actions. This is this portion here where those improvements are noted as actions. So you have one primary improvement listed up here that's made up of these kinds of sub-actions underneath, the first, second, and third sub-action, all associated with this first action. And then so on for every one of those critical actions or improvements that you've identified. And then over here, number 2, where you're prioritizing the improvements, this is where that portion is identified, where you're trying to set the priority for all those sub-actions. And then for the 4th item here, identifying any prerequisite or sub-actions, that's within here where you might specifically identify a prerequisite where here in this example you can't get this action 1C performed until action 1A is complete. So that's where you might track any kind of prerequisite actions if there's any that are relative like that. And then finally, you want to identify for this 5th step who the owners and due dates are associated with each of those actions. So you can see who to go to for who's responsible for the different actions, and you see what commitment they have and how they're progressing and tracking with actually completing the actions that they're assigned to.
Okay, so let's dig into that process for building the pilot plan by exploring the first 3 steps.
Well, as an input into your meeting for building the pilot plan, you're going to start off with identifying all the improvements. So at this point, when you're ready to build the pilot plan, you should already have this complete, and you might have already completed as well the risk assessment using the FMEA tool, having walked through all the process steps related to those improvements that are implemented. So at this point, when you're walking into the pilot plan, you should already have that information done. So now for the process itself, for the meeting when you're trying to work with your team, you might start off with a kickoff. That is where you might bring in the sponsor or champion to help kick off the meeting. So we set the stage for what their expectations are for what they're going to accomplish during the team meeting. And you might ask the sponsor or champion to come back at the end of your meeting to review the results with everyone. And as necessary, you might want to review each of those improvements at this kickoff time to ensure everyone agrees and understanding these are the improvements they're going to be building this pilot plan around. So then the second step for what you want to do that occurs now within the process during the meeting is you want to prioritize all the improvements. So if there are any multiple improvements that you've identified, then everyone should agree at the level of priority for each one of those. So they should clearly understand the order and set that order for how you're going to prioritize those items. This is really critical because some pilot actions may require pulling from the same resources. So by defining the priority of the improvements up front like this, it will help clarify any action owners the priority that each resource can provide to the sub-actions they're assigned to. So it's also okay if some of the improvements have an equal priority, as long as it doesn't create a delay or there's no conflict among those resources that might be required for some of those sub-actions. So you might want to sort the list of all the improvements in order of priority based off of what the team has agreed to. And then for the third step, this is where we're going to break down the improvements into specific actions. Now some of the improvements may require similar actions, such as if you're going to do some coordination with IT changes or maybe certain data extractions that are really similar across the different actions. So for very similar improvements like that or similar actions, you might want to consider grouping them together to share the actions as long as it makes sense to your team. The action should also be defined briefly. So as you're notating each one of those actions, make sure you're keeping it brief, because if there are longer explanations that are required, then you might want to notate those separately.
Alright, now let's dig a little further into the details for the last 2 steps of this process for building a pilot plan.
So as we continue identifying the 4th step in this process during the meeting of building a pilot plan, we want to identify any prerequisite or sub-actions associated with those actions. So you might want to begin by identifying all the steps and actions required to complete that one overall action or improvement that was identified. So sub-actions should represent logical steps, possibly defined by the different resources that are needed, or maybe the approvals, or maybe system events or resources that are required for that. Now if the same action has different sub-actions that can be done simultaneously, then notate them as separate sub-actions. There's no reason to keep them together if you can track them separately like that, if they can be done simultaneously. Now it may help to start with the goal for the high-level action, then step backwards to find the respective sub-action. So it may not be real easy for everyone to work through. So again, if you find your team struggling through this, then you might want to start with the end goal for the completion of the action, and then step backwards through kind of like reverse engineering. What are those necessary steps that would have occurred right before the goal, and then keep going backwards to help the team think through the logical steps necessary in order to complete the overall action. So if a sub-action is dependent on another sub-action, then you might want to add the first action's number as a prerequisite to the second one. This goes back to that prerequisite section to make sure that you've tracked along all the possible prerequisites associated with other actions. But be patient. This part of the pilot plan, as you're building this, can get extremely detailed, so you got to be sure that all the sub-actions are fully identified and you try not to gloss over any. Now for the final output for what you're going to create from this meeting and what your ultimate goal is, this is going to be where you're going to assign action owners and due dates for all those actions. And this is really critical. The action owners and due dates have to be identified for each sub-actions, every single one of them. Without this, otherwise there could be loss of accountability and the pilot could be at risk for delays or failure along the way. So it's okay if there's one person that you might have designated as an owner for one action, and therefore all the respective sub-actions roll up to that same owner. That's okay if that happens. This part of the meeting also makes people very uncomfortable. It's because they're not comfortable always with figuring out who the right person is. You might notice a lot of silence. from folks, but that's okay. Don't let that stop you from continuing and moving forward with this. So when is it okay to use TBD, which refers to be determined, as far as filling in any owner's names or any due dates? Well, the TBD should never be identified as an action owner. Every action must have an owner. So make sure if you've got the right people in the room who are part of this exercise, then you should at least have an appropriate name on there. If they don't think they're the right name, then you can put them as an action owner to go figure out who the right owner is. But you should have at least some accountability for who's going to be responsible for each of those sub-actions. TBD can be used as the due date for some actions, especially if you're going to be assigning it to some of the lower priority actions, but as long as that action owner agrees, then that might be appropriate to use that. Now be sure the due dates for sub-action don't precede the due dates for respective prerequisite actions. Obviously, if there's a prerequisite, you can't get that done until the prerequisite is done first. So just make sure it makes sense in how you're tying your due dates along with those prerequisites, that you haven't accounted for any gaps or things that are just out of order. And be sure the owners and due dates all seem reasonable. Just look it over, not only just the fact that you've identified them all, but make sure it looks reasonable. Now, if it looks like you have, for example, an owner name that appears many times on many actions, then you might want to call them out just to double check that, to make sure that they agree that they are going to be working all these actions and they've set these due dates on them. Now, they may not have realized in the very beginning that they were going to have so many actions, so it might change the due dates they were originally committing to. And now is a good time to bring that up. If you notice that there is a person that shows up multiple times, call it out. Make sure that you've at least treated it so they know whether they can accomplish the particular action according to the date that they've committed themselves to.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
I'd like you to identify at least 2 different projects or initiatives from within your organization that involve the implementation of a significant process change. And then for each of those different examples, try to ask yourself the following questions. First of all, were the process changes piloted? If they weren't, then why weren't they piloted? If a pilot was run, then was a formal pilot plan built before actually beginning the pilot? If it wasn't, then why not? And what problems during the pilot and implementation could have been avoided if a formal pilot plan was built in advance? And what delays were encountered in the pilot, if there were any, that could have been avoided if a formal pilot plan were built and used to help coordinate and communicate and manage all those necessary actions normally identified within the pilot plan?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.